All rise.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sheila Carrigan. I'm Jim Carrigan's oldest of 6 children. And I'd like to thank you all very much for being here today. Competitors, thank you. Really want to thank Judge Rodriguez, who is a federal district court judge now, and John Baker, who was one of my dad's very best friends. I also want to introduce my mother, Beverly Carrigan, who's right there, and is always proud to tell you she's in her 94th year, which means she's 93, because she tries to get us to do the math every time. So I want to tell you a little bit about my dad. He was born in Mobridge, South Dakota. His father was a baker. His mother was a one-room school teacher, and he and his 4 siblings grew up very poor. We have pictures of them in flour sack pajamas. And he remembered walking into stores when he was growing up, we're of Irish descent, in case you hadn't guessed, that said no blacks, but I don't think it said blacks, no Jews, and no Irish. And that was, I think, the beginning for him of a sense that he wanted to work towards justice and equality. He loved trial work as a lawyer, as a judge, as a professor, and we are grateful to the University of Colorado because they hired him. So we moved to Boulder when I was in kindergarten and got to grow up here and then raise my kids here. My parents are both first-generation college graduates and thus gave us the gift of understanding how important education is and passing that on to our kids. He would be thrilled if he could be here today and see you all. He loved nothing more than coaching young lawyers and working in the courtroom. So thanks very much.
Oh 07-5213, Gabrielle Robinson, plaintiff versus Flagworthy. I understand we have some motions.
Yes, Your Honor. Plaintiff also has written entries of appearances, if that would help.
All right. Do we also have defense motions?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. So first of all, if we can have appearances of counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. My name is Suchinder Carrigan, and alongside my co-counsel, Gabrielle Stenholm, we represent the plaintiff, Gabriella Robinson, and the estate of Gary Robinson in this case, Your Honor.
All right.
Your Honor, my name is Nicola Cooper, and my co-counsel, Delaney Duplessis, and I represent Flightworthy Aircraft, the defendant in today's case.
All right. All right. Do we have any matters that we need to take up before we start with the motions?
Yes, Your Honor. We have a few housekeeping matters.
Okay.
Your Honor, we'd request walking around for opens and closes in the well.
It depends upon the or not. So are we mic'd up where you can be heard if you're walking around?
I don't believe we're mic'd up, Your Honor, but it would just be right in front of the podium for opens and closes.
All right. We'll permit that with regard to opening and closing.
Your Honor, we'd like to notify the judges of our witnesses' pronouns.
Okay.
Our Gabriella Robinson is she, her. Our Rufus Pennington is he, him. And the decedent Gary Robinson is also he, him.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that. Defense counsel, similarly, share with us the pronouns for your witnesses.
Yes, Your Honor. Our witnesses are Tracy LeDuc, who uses she, her pronouns, and Dusty Stalker, who uses he, him pronouns.
All right. Very well. Anything further?
Just a few more,
Calligan.
Calligan, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Just a few more, Your Honor. We would like to read 2 of the stipulations in the case packet into the record.
All right.
Stipulation number 11, which is on page 2.
Okay.
And it reads, all exhibits in the file are authentic. In addition, each exhibit contained in the file is the original of that document, unless otherwise noted on the exhibit or as established by the evidence.
All right.
And also stipulation number 15. And Your Honor, this specific stipulation has been edited to include the word not in between the words does and permit.
All right. And both sides have stipulated to the stipulated change?
Yes, on the plaintiff's side, Your Honor.
Well,
Both sides have.
stipulated unless it's by the plaintiff.
Both sides have, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Go ahead and read it into the record.
This competition does not permit teams to argue additional case law and other relevant authority to support the team's argument on motions and evidentiary issues. No changes are permitted to the provided jury instructions or the substantive law stated below.
All right.
And Your Honor, we'd like to constructively have the remaining stipulations read into the record.
You'd like to what?
Constructively have the remaining stipulations read.
The court will take judicial notice of the remaining stipulation.
And 2 last matters, Your Honor, for the plaintiff. Both parties have stipulated to the admissibility of Exhibit 3 with the redaction of paragraph 3.
All right, hold on a moment. Exhibit 3, which is the NTSB accident report.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Ms. Cooper or Ms. Can you pronounce your name for me again?
Duplessis, Your Honor.
Duplessis, my apologies for that mistake. Please correct me if I'm, but do either of you have any objection with regard to National Transportation Safety Board aircraft accident report?
No objection, Your Honor.
Who has got the phone? I ask that everybody silence your phones, please. Your daughter dined you out.
Is that you, Mom? It's me, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I couldn't
Your
get it
daughter
out
is
of my
giving you a
purse.
hard time about this.
I will.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm just curious.
We have no objections.
Okay, so exhibit 3, with paragraph 3, will be admitted with that redaction.
Yes, Your Honor. And finally, for the plaintiff, both parties have stipulated to the admissibility of Exhibit 2.
All right, exhibit 2 is the bank examination.
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right. And that is stipulated to
That's correct, Your Honor.
Ms. Cooper, is that accurate?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. All right, exhibit 2 will be admitted for clarification and ease of reference during the course of the trial. To any stipulated exhibit as stipulated exhibit 2 or stipulated exhibit 3, so you don't have the judges up here paging around to figure out.
No further housekeeping for the plaintiff, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Calligan. Anything from the defense team?
Yes, Your Honor. We would like to ask for permission to refer to the exhibits as they are pre-marked. They're all numbered.
You'll need to refer to them as exhibits 1, 2.
Oh, we just want to clarify that you're all right with us.
Yes.
Refer to them with those numbers.
For ease of reference, I will tell you candidly, it's much easier if you refer to it as exhibit 1, the, whatever it is, exhibit 2, stipulated exhibit, the bank audit report, et cetera. So that, again, you don't have us all up here fumbling with paper and we're actually looking at you and paying attention to them. All right.
And would you like us to constructively approach when making objections, or could we assume we're outside the presence of the jury?
You can assume you're outside the presence of the jury.
And Can Wendy maybe constructively swear in all witnesses?
Yes. We'll assume that all witnesses have been sworn in, and I believe one of the stipulations was that the depositions are under oath.
And the defense would like the court to take judicial notice of substantive matter number 4 on page 4 of the case packet. There is one piece of case law that does apply in today's case. It is E. Donda v. Lemonheads, where the Lone Star Supreme Court held that a decedent's suicide breaks the chain of causation in a products liability case and serves as a complete defense. And the defense would like to clarify, we will be raising an affirmative defense of suicide.
Okay. Well, that is in the pleadings, so the court would not need to take judicial notice of it. It is a part of the record.
And finally, the defense would note that the parties have stipulated that Dusty Stalker may not talk about Mr. Robinson's mental state or intentionality with regards to pulling this.
Dusty Stockard is the airplane mechanic.
He's the employee of Flightworthy, an airplane mechanic.
I'm sorry, you trailed off. You gotta speak loudly or into a mic so that you can make sure we can hear you.
He is an employee of Flightworthy who will be testifying today.
Okay, and the stipulation is again?
That he cannot testify about Mr. Robinson's mental state or intentionality.
Okay. If it comes up, then I'll.
This is
Anything else?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Great. Do we still have?
one motion to eliminate, Your Honor.
All right.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, I would go to the podium, please, if I were you.
Is this better, Your
Honor?
Honor?
That mic up so that you're not hunched over. There you go. All right.
Your Honor, the plaintiff moves to exclude any testimony regarding the closure of Gary Robinson's bank after his death. For some context, Your Honor, this is a products liability case in which the plaintiff, Gabriella Robinson, is suing Flightworthy Aircraft Company for a defective airplane which caused Mr. Robinson, Gabriella Robinson's late husband's death. We anticipate that the defense will be offering Tracy LeDuc as a witness, who is a banking examiner for the state of Lone Star. More specifically, Tracy LeDuc is the one who investigated Gary Robinson's bank during the time he was alive and was the one who initiated potential problems in calling the FBI within that bank. We anticipate that this line of questioning with Tracy LeDuc will specifically go to the defense's affirmative defense of suicide, and more specifically will go to Mr. Robinson's mental state at the time of his death. We'd move to exclude any testimony as to what happened to the bank after Mr. Robinson's death under the rules of evidence 401 and 403. Under Rule 401, evidence is relevant only if it has a tendency to make a fact of consequence more or less likely. Considering the defense's affirmative defense is suicide, any knowledge of what happened to Mr. Robinson's bank after he died does not impact Mr. Robinson's mental state at the time of his death, and as a result makes no fact of consequence more or less probable. Next, under Rule 403, relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by an unfair prejudice or a danger of confusing the issues. In this specific case, we believe this line of questioning going to what happened to Mr. Robinson's bank after his death will be used improperly by any jury to take it that Mr. Robinson knew what would happen to his bank at the time of his death. More specifically, we believe that the defense aims to use such testimony specifically to go to the severity of the consequences Mr. Robinson could face by any investigations that were happening after his death. However, Mr. Robinson would not know any of that information at the time of his death, and as a result, any line of questioning must stop at the time of his death and should not be pursued past his death. There is no probative value here, whereas the prejudicial value is substantially high. As such, we move to exclude any such testimony, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Counsel, who will be responding?
I don't know.
All right, please.
Your Honor, under Rule 401, evidence is relevant if it has any tendency to make a fact of consequence more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. Here, in this case, the testimony that Mr. Robinson's bank eventually did end up shutting down does have a tendency to make a fact of consequence, in this case, more or less probable. Tracy LeDuc will be able to testify today that she had made Mr. Robinson aware of the investigation that was going to be conducted into the bank before his plane crash. And therefore, what happened as a result of that investigation is relevant in today's case. There will be testimony that can show that Mr. Robinson was aware of this potential investigation, and therefore the consequences of the investigation are relevant. Under Rule 403, relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by its prejudicial effect. Here, the probative value of this evidence is great as it goes to the struggles that Mr. Robinson was experiencing at that time because he was aware of this investigation and its potential consequences. And it.
Let me just interrupt you. I don't understand Mr. Carrigan to be saying that information that Mr. Robinson had or was aware of prior to his death should be excluded. I understand his argument to be only events that occurred or was not aware prior to his death. Why wouldn't something that Mr. Robinson was at least aware of prior to his death be relevant to the affirmative defense?
You want me to repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, well, all I'm saying is, it's my understanding that Mr. Carrigan is arguing that information or which he was not aware of.
The information that occurred after his death, even though because of his death he could not be aware of it, it does help the jury evaluate the knowledge that he had before.
How?
Mr. Robinson was afraid that the bank was going to close, and the fact that it did eventually close affirms his fears.
Well, I'm understanding, Mr. Carrigan, the fact that he was afraid that it would close would be admissible, but the fact that it did later close would not. Why is that line, why is that distinction not sufficient to satisfy both 401 and 403?
It is not sufficient to satisfy 401 or 403 because while Mr. Robinson, may I actually have a moment to confer with my co-counsel?
Sure.
My apologies, Your Honor. The evidence that the bank eventually did shut down does give weight to Mr. Robinson's fears before. And while that evidence is admissible and his fears are admissible, the evidence that the bank eventually did close helps bolster those fears and will help the jury understand that what Mr. Robinson was fearing was something that was going to happen.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll let you have the last word on this one, Mr. Carrigan, given that this is your motion, but be brief, please.
Yes, Your Honor. Just one response, Your Honor. Pursuant to Rule 403, relevant evidence only may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice, and that's what's happening here, Your Honor. We have no objection to any line of questioning with Mr. LeDuc regarding what was happening in the investigations at the time of Mr. Robinson's death or prior to his death. But as opposing counsel just demonstrated, any testimony that goes to the weight of those fears specific to things that happened after his death are highly prejudicial. Mr. Robinson didn't know any of those things at the time of his death, and as such, any weight from evidence that happened after his death should not be admitted, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right, with regard to the plaintiff's motion, the limiting court rules that the bright line is what Mr. Robinson knew or what was aware of prior to his death. If the evidence can be tied up to demonstrate that Mr. Robinson knew about the information prior to his death, was a concern, he was afraid of it, or anything of that nature, it will come in and it is relevant under 401 and not outweighed by any potential prejudice under 403. However, if it is evidence that he was not aware of prior to his death, it cannot be probative of his state of mind or the reasons for his death or go to the affirmative defense since he clearly was unaware of it. So if it cannot be tied up and demonstrated that he was aware of it prior to his death, it will not come in. All right?
No further motions for the plaintiff, Your
All
Honor.
right. Thank you. Anything from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
At this time, the defense moves to exclude Exhibit 1 pursuant to Federal Rule of Evidence 801, 404, and 403. For a bit of background, Exhibit 1 is an article from a magazine entitled Flyboy, and the article within discusses flightworthy planes. The author of the article is not known to any parties in this case and will not be testifying today. Under Rule 801, hearsay is any out-of-court statement being used to prove the truth of the matter asserted within. Here, this article represents an out-of-court statement, and therefore it is inadmissible hearsay. Under Rule 404B1, evidence of prior crimes, wrongs, or acts are inadmissible to prove a person's character in order to show that on a particular occasion, a person acted in accordance with that character. Here, this article details 17 prior crashes of flightworthy planes, and it theorizes that these crashes were caused by a failure of an auxiliary fuel pump switch. If this exhibit is admitted, it will be used to prove that what happened in those crashes is what happened to Mr. Robinson's plane, which is propensity evidence and is barred under 404B1. Further, under 403, relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by its prejudicial effect. Here, this evidence has little probative value. No one testifying today has any more knowledge of these crashes or their circumstances, and they're only theorized to be caused by a switch failure. However, the prejudicial value of this evidence is high, as the jury will take this evidence and use it as propensity evidence to show that what happened to those planes is what happened to Mr. Robinson's plane. And therefore, this evidence is inadmissible under 403 as well.
All right. Mr. Carrigan?
Yes, Your Honor. We'll address each objection one at a time. We'll start with 801. We believe that there's two ways that this specific exhibit will come into evidence. First, we anticipate to provide the court some context that this specific exhibit will be discussed by Rufus Pennington, and a witness from the plaintiff, who is an aviation mechanic. More specifically, we believe that this specific exhibit that you're looking at right now in Exhibit 1 should come in under the 803.18 exception to hearsay, in that this specific exhibit is a learned treatise and periodical. We anticipate that we will be able to lay the proper foundation to show that there are many volumes of this specific magazine, and that experts rely on the magazine, and that the expert relying on the magazine will be available for direct and cross-examination, satisfying the specific requirements in 803.18. But what's more, we will only be using this exhibit, in Exhibit 2, to show the effect reading that article had on Rufus Pennington. And as such, we will not be using any of the testimony within Exhibit 2 for the truth of the matter, but rather for the effect reading the article had on the listener. There's also a few other types of testimony and other specific versions of hearsay within Exhibit 1. And in order, it is from the National Transportation Safety Board, Dusty Stockard, and Dusty Stockard, Your Honor. First off, we're more than happy to redact paragraphs 1 and paragraphs 5, which are the two paragraphs that contain testimony from the NTSB investigator. Additionally, Dusty Stockard is an agent of Flightworthy Aircraft Company, and within Exhibit 2 testifies that within that exhibit, all of his testimony was offered as Flightworthy's spokesperson. As a result, under Rule 801 D2D, Dusty Stockard offered the testimony as a party opponent in his capacity as an agent or an employee and should not be excluded by the rule against hearsay. Next, moving on to the 404 objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 404B, evidence of a wrong cannot be used to prove character and show that on a particular occasion that that person acted in accordance to that character. We have three responses here, Your Honor. First off, 404B specifically talks about persons, not companies. We anticipate using the specific evidence in Exhibit 2 against Flightworthy Aircraft Company. So we don't believe 404B applies. But what's more, we believe it fits under the 404B2 limited use of knowledge and motive, insofar as we're more than happy to redact paragraphs 1 and paragraphs 5, which specifically were the parts that concerned opposing counsel. The remainder of the article discusses potential problems with the automatic auxiliary fuel pump switch, which was created by Dusty Stockard, a defense witness in this case and an employee of Flightworthy Aircraft Company. As such, we will be using this testimony both for Rufus Pennington and the actions he took after knowing of potential problems with the switch and what he wanted to do or did after reading the article, and specifically to what Mr. Stockard did after providing testimony and being made aware of potential problems with the switch and what he did before and after being made aware of those problems. As such, we're using it for that limited purpose and are okay with jury instructions to that end. Finally, the 403 objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 403, relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice. Here, this entire case revolves around the automatic switch that Dusty Stockard invented. The plaintiff's theory of the case, Your Honor, is specifically that that switch was defective, and we anticipate several lines of questioning going to what Mr. Stockard, the inventor of the switch, both knew and didn't know in the testing he did and didn't do with all the information that he had during all the times material to this case. As such, the probative value is extremely high. And insofar as paragraphs 1 and paragraphs 5 are unrelated to that end, we are fine with redacting those paragraphs to address opposing counsel's concerns.
Right, thank you. Ms. Cooper, I'll give you the last word on something that is to address whether or not the offer to redact paragraphs 1 and 5 by plaintiff satisfies the concerns that you've raised.
The offers by plaintiff to redact do not satisfy the concerns I have raised. In paragraph 4, there's also mention of prior crashes, and that would bring up the same propensity issue under 404. Furthermore, 803.18 does not apply to this type of article. The rule against hearsay does not bar the admission of a statement from a learned treatise that is called to the attention of an expert on cross or relied on by an expert in direct examination if the publication is established as a reliable authority. Here, there are many reasons to question the reliability of this article. On the cover, it discusses whether or not penguins can fly and advertises a foldout for the new Delta agent, Miss June. Further, this article is authored by Mike Sky King. This is not the sort of article an expert would reasonably rely on, and there are many reasons to question the reliability of this article. Therefore, the hearsay exception under Rule 803.18 does not apply, and this evidence is inadmissible.
All right, well, the court will defer ruling on necessary for its admission, and so we shall see. All right. Counsel are instructed to advise the court prior to the utilization of this document with any witness so that we can make, we'll be alerted, right? And then foundation has been made. All right, thank you. All right, are we ready to proceed with the case?
Plenty of case, Your Honor.
Defendants?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
opening statements. Do we have time limits on these or?
Your Honor, at this time, I believe each side has 60 minutes total to run their entire case in chief. And if it's all right with you, our witnesses will be keeping time.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Your case in chief, does that include your cross-examination?
It does.
That's your total?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you very much.
Totally.
All right.
May I proceed?
Yes.
It was never foolproof to begin with. This is a case about an irresponsible company and its narcissistic engineer. Mr. Gary Robinson was a man who knew his way around a plane. As of 2005, he had been a licensed and experienced pilot for the past 5 years. Flight was his passion. He spent his evenings flipping through aviation magazines and journals. He owned his own plane, of which he was proud, and he enjoyed taking frequent flights around the state of Lone Star. A man of many talents, Mr. Robinson wasn't just a pilot. He also owned Armadillo State Bank, the largest bank in the state of Lone Star. His career was promising, his talents admirable, but all of that came crashing down on January 15th, 2005. On January 15th, 2005, Mr. Robinson got into his plane, intending to take off from a runway in the city of Smallville and fly home to Armadillo. Mr. Robinson had every intention of going home that night. Before he took off, he called his wife of 30 years, Gabriella Robinson, and left her a voicemail saying that he was leaving the airport. He then climbed into his airplane, turned it on, steered it down the runway, and took off the same way he had done countless times before, but this time something was wrong. An automatic fuel pump switch, a device installed in his aircraft by the manufacturer, had turned on at the wrong time, and the result was disastrous. Too much fuel flooded Mr. Robinson's right engine, and the right engine quit. The left engine tried to make up for it, but instead the plane flipped, spun in the air, and took a nosedive into the ground, just 50 feet off the runway. When the smoke cleared, the plane was mangled on the ground, and Gary Robinson never made it home. Mr. Robinson's widow, Gabriella Robinson, is suing Flightworthy Aircraft Company today, the manufacturer of Mr. Robinson's airplane. My name is Gabrielle Stenholm, and alongside my co-counsel, Mr. Suchinder Kalyan, we represent the plaintiff, Gabriella Robinson, and the estate of Gary Robinson in today's case. Now we're going to have the opportunity to bring before you 2 witnesses. First, you're going to hear from Gabriella Robinson herself. And she's going to tell you a little bit more about who her husband Gary was. She's going to tell you that he cared about flying. He loved it. He cared about his business. His business was his life. She's going to tell you that he was involved in his wider Armadillo community and that he wanted to make it home that night. She'll tell you that after 30 long years of marriage, the last time she heard her husband's voice was over that voicemail when he was telling her he was leaving the Smallville airport. Now today you're also going to hear from Mr. Rufus Pennington. Mr. Pennington is an aircraft mechanic who frequently did maintenance on Mr. Robinson's airplane. Mr. Pennington is going to explain to you in detail exactly what an automatic fuel pump switch is and exactly how it can fail. He's going to tell you today that if that switch turns on at the wrong time, it can flood an engine. He's going to tell you today that if an engine can flood, a plane can crash. The defense is also going to get an opportunity today to bring before you 2 witnesses. The first person you're going to hear from is Mr. Dusty Stockard. Dusty Stockard is an aviation engineer working for Flightworthy Aircraft Company. In fact, he's the person who designed the automatic fuel pump switch at issue today. And he's going to tell you, he thinks it's foolproof. He's going to tell you today he thinks that switch cannot possibly fail. But what he's also going to tell you today is that while he did design that switch, he didn't manufacture it. Rather, he'll tell you today he outsourced the manufacturing of that switch to another country where it would be cheaper. He'll also tell you today that he believes the loss of one or both engines should never keep a good pilot from landing safely, but not before he admits that he himself isn't even a pilot. Finally, you're going to hear today from Ms. Tracy LeDuc. Ms. LeDuc is a bank examiner who frequently conducted examinations on the loans at Gary Robinson's bank, but she's also something more. She'll tell you today she was having an affair with Gary Robinson for months leading up to his death. She'll tell you she found his loans in his bank to be sound. That is, until he broke off the relationship. Now, the charge in today's case is product liability negligence. And that means that we as the plaintiff bear the burden of proving to you by preponderance of the evidence that a design, manufacturing, or marketing defect was the producing cause of Mr. Gary Robinson's death today. A producing cause is a cause so substantial, so significant, that the injury today most likely would have not happened without it. By a preponderance of the evidence means that we must prove to you that it is more likely than not that a design, marketing, or manufacturing defect on the part of Flightworthy Aircraft Company was that producing cause in Mr. Robinson's death. And we are going to show you that today. At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Carrigan, is going to come before you, and he's going to talk to you about the law. And he's going to remind you of the facts of today's case. He's going to remind you that Mr. Robinson was a skilled pilot who wanted to make it home. He's going to remind you that automatic fuel switch was never foolproof. Because this is a case about an irresponsible company and its narcissistic engineer. And at that time, we will ask you to find Flightworthy Aircraft Company liable. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel.
May I proceed?
Yes.
A failing bank, a forsaken affair, and a flipped switch. On January 15th, 2005, Gary Robinson was sitting on an airstrip in his plane alone. He was seemingly prepared to return to his hometown of Armadillo. However, returning to that place meant he would finally have to face up to the consequences of his own actions. Now, within Mr. Robinson's reach that day was a manual fuel pump switch in his plane that could bring about an end to all his problems. One wrong flip of that switch and his plane could crash during takeoff. Later that day, Mr. Robinson's wrecked plane was found near that very airstrip, with its nose buried in the ground. Mr. Robinson, unfortunately, passed away as a result of his crash that day. The circumstances of Mr. Robinson's death are certainly tragic. However, Flightworthy Aircraft Company is not responsible for tragedies of human error. My name is Delaney Duplessis, and my co-counsel, Nicola Cooper, and I represent the defendant, Flightworthy Aircraft Company, in today's case. Now, I'd like to start from the beginning and discuss the state of Mr. Robinson's life in the weeks leading up to his fatal crash. He was by all means a successful man. I mean, he owned and operated the largest bank in the town of Armadillo. He was a man that was very proud of his position within the community. All seemed to be going well with Mr. Robinson's business affairs, at least from the outside looking in. The first person to realize something wrong was happening at the Armadillo State Bank was Tracy LeDuc, a state banking examiner. She will explain to you today exactly what she found suspicious about Mr. Robinson's banking transactions. She will also detail the methods Mr. Robinson used to try and hide the truth from her. How he offered to fly her in his private plane. How he whisked her from town to town. How he took all her concerns and explained them away in private meetings behind closed doors. Ms. LeDuc's romantic relationship with Mr. Robinson clouded her initial suspicions as to what was happening at the Armadillo State Bank. However, Mr. Robinson's unique solutions to his banking problems could not last forever. In the weeks leading up to Mr. Robinson's crash, his wife of 30 years found out about his affair with Ms. LeDuc. Mr. Robinson had to end his relationship with Ms. LeDuc, and she was free from his influence. Through her continued work with the State Banking Commission, Ms. LeDuc went on to discover several additional bad loans issued by Mr. Robinson's bank. Mr. Robinson's banking problems had been exposed, and as a result, the Armadillo State Bank closed its doors for good. On January 15, 2005, Mr. Robinson would have been flying home to a wife he was unfaithful to and a bank on the brink of failure. Now, Mr. Robinson was piloting a flight-worthy aircraft the day of his crash. So you will have the opportunity to hear from two individuals that investigated the potential causes of that crash. We will present to you the testimony of Dusty Stockard, a longtime flight-worthy employee and an experienced aeronautical engineer. Members of the jury, he designs these planes for a living, so he has unique knowledge of how they operate. And he will tell you, in his opinion, that this crash was no accident. He will explain to you the physical evidence of Mr. Robinson's wrecked plane, and how the manual fuel pump switch was flipped to the on position. You will learn how flipping on that switch at the wrong time could lead to one thing: a crash. Mr. Stockard will walk you through all of the physical evidence in this case and how it informed his final conclusion. You will also have the opportunity to hear from plaintiff's witness, Rufus Pennington. While listening to Mr. Pennington's testimony, keep in mind that Mr. Pennington was a close friend of Mr. Robinson and remains close to Mrs. Robinson to this day. Even so, despite his personal relationships with the Robinsons, Mr. Pennington will have to admit to you that when he observed the physical state of Mr. Robinson's plane, the manual switch was flipped on. At the end of today's case, my co-counsel, Ms. Cooper, will explain to you the law that you will have to follow in coming to your decision today. She will ask you to carefully consider all the evidence and testimony presented to you today, and to keep in mind any potential questions the plaintiff may leave unanswered. You will be asked to find that Flightworthy Aircraft Company did not design, manufacture, or market a defective plane. Ultimately, you will be asked to find that Mr. Robinson, as unfortunate as it is, intentionally took his life on January 15, 2005. Finally, I ask you to remember a failing bank, a forsaken affair, and a flipped switch. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, counsel, you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Gabriella Robinson to the stand.
All right, Ms. Robinson.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Good evening, Ms. Robinson. Can you please tell us your name and spell your last for the record?
My name is Gabriella Robinson, last name spelled Robinson.
Ms. Robinson, do you remember January 15th, 2005?
Yes, I do.
Why do you remember that day?
That's the day that my husband died. The plane he was flying crashed.
I'm so sorry for your loss, Ms. Robinson. If you ever need a break at all, just let me know. We'll definitely get to how your husband died, but I'd like to start by letting the jury get to know the two of you a little bit more. How did you meet Mr. Robinson? How long were the two of you married? Were the two of you close?
Yes, of course we were. I still remember the days that we would have tea and cookies in his office and chat.
Ms. Robinson, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your late husband. As his wife of 30 years, do you know if Mr. Robinson was involved in the community?
Yes, he was.
How was he involved?
He was the deacon at our church, and he was also the president of the opera board of directors here in Armadillo.
Do you know if your husband had any other hobbies?
Yes, he did. It ended up costing him his life, but he flew planes.
We'll definitely get to that hobby, Ms. Robinson, but I'd like to learn a little bit about your late husband's employment. Before he died, was Mr. Robinson employed?
Yes, he was.
What did he do?
He was the owner, CEO, and CFO of the Armadillo State Bank.
You had mentioned earlier that you were hired as a teller at a bank. Is that the same bank as the one you're telling us about right now?
Yes, it is.
Ms. Robinson, do you have any specialized training in loan forecasting?
No, I do not.
In your role as a teller, did you ever have to assess loans?
Objection, relevance.
Let me ask that one more time, Ms. Robinson. In your role as a teller, did you ever personally have to assess loans?
No, I do not.
What was your knowledge of Mr. Robinson's bank?
I left all the bank affairs to Gary.
Ms. Robinson, earlier you had mentioned that Mr. Robinson flew planes. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Do you know if Mr. Robinson was a pilot?
Yes, he was a pilot.
How long had he been flying planes for?
He had been flying for about 5 years.
Do you know how much time Mr. Robinson spent flying planes?
I don't know an exact amount of time, but I know that he spent a lot of time on it.
How do you know that?
Besides flying for 5 years, he would read about aviation almost every single night, and he would regularly get his plane worked on.
Let's talk about both of those things, but we'll start with reading. You just said that he would read a lot about aviation. Do you know what he would read?
Yes, he would read a journal on aviation engineered by Flyboy.
Would you recognize that journal if I showed it to you today?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, I'm showing opposing counsel a clean and unmarked copy of what has been pre-marked as Exhibit 1. Permission to approach the witness with the same?
Yes.
And Your Honor, for judicial notice, this is the same exhibit that we were talking about in opposing counsel's motion in limine. Ms. Robinson, for identification, what are we looking at here in Exhibit 1?
This is the Journal of Aviation Engineering I just referred to.
How do you recognize this specific article in Journal 1?
I found this in Gary's desk after he passed away.
Have you seen any other volumes of this journal?
Oh yes, there were lots of volumes of this journal in his desk as well.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness to retrieve the exhibit?
Yes.
Ms. Robinson, you also mentioned that your husband would get his plane worked on. Do you know who worked on your husband's plane?
Yes, I do.
Who is that?
His name is Rufus Pennington.
How do you know Rufus Pennington?
Gary, Rufus, and I were all really good friends.
Have you seen Mr. Pennington since Mr. Robinson's death?
Yes, I have. We've been to dinner a couple of times.
Ms. Robinson, during opening statements, opposing counsel was talking about some bank investigations that were going on in your husband's bank. Do you remember hearing that?
I do remember hearing that, yes.
Did you know anything about those investigations?
No, I did not. Like I said, I left all the banking stuff to Gary.
Do you know any of the people investigating Mr. Robinson's bank?
I only know of one,
Who's the one?
Tracy Ledoux.
How do you know Tracy Leduc?
For a little while, Tracy was having an affair with my husband.
I just have one more question about that affair, Ms. Robinson. Do you know why Mr. Robinson was having an affair with Tracy Leduc?
Objection, speculation.
I believe the question is, do you know? She may not speculate, she may answer the specific question you asked.
Let me ask that one more time, Ms. Robinson. Do you know why Mr. Robinson was in an affair with Tracy Leduc?
No, I do not.
Ms. Robinson, I want to move forward and talk about the day your husband died. Again, if you ever need a break, just let me know. Where were you when you learned that your husband had died?
I was at my house.
Were you alone?
No, I was not.
Who else was with you?
Rufus Pennington was at my house.
Did you know your husband would be flying that day?
Yes, I did.
How'd you know?
He called me and told me that he would be taking off.
Objection, hearsay.
May I make an offer of proof, Your Honor?
Yes.
I anticipate that this witness will testify that Mr. Robinson called and said, "I will be taking off from the Smallville airport." Under Rule 801, hearsay is an out-of-court statement offered for the truth of the matter asserted. Under Rule 803(3), an exception to hearsay is a then existing state of mind, more specifically, a statement of intent, motive, or plan. The specific testimony that I anticipate this witness will provide specifically goes to intent, as the statement the witness will be testifying to is simply that Mr. Robinson was going to leave the Smallville airport. Let me ask that one more time, Ms. Robinson. What did you hear?
My husband told me that he would be taking off from the Smallville airport in a few minutes.
Did you ever see Mr. Robinson again?
I did not. He died on that plane.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Cooper?
Good evening, Ms. Robinson. I know it must be difficult for you to be here today, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. You mentioned that you and Mr. Robinson met while working at the bank.
Yes, that's correct.
You were a teller at the time,
Yes, I was.
and he would offer you tea and cookies.
Yes,
So that's a yes.
yes,
In the Armadillo State Bank, Mr. Robinson, he owned this bank.
yes, he did.
He was the president of the bank,
Yes,
the chief executive officer of the bank,
yes,
and he was the chief financial officer of the bank as well.
yes, he was.
And you briefly mentioned earlier that you had learned your husband was having an affair with Miss Leduc. This relationship ended,
Yes, Gary cut it off.
so that's a yes.
Yes,
A couple weeks before Mr. Robinson's crash.
that's correct.
And you never flew with Mr. Robinson,
No, I do not want to fly.
so that's a no.
No,
And Mr. Robinson called you before he took off,
yes, he did.
and you did not answer this call,
I wasn't able to make it to the phone, but
so that's a no. You were not able to answer the call.
no, I was not.
You had company over,
Rufus Pennington was also at my home.
and Rufus Pennington, he's a friend of yours.
Yes, Rufus Carrigan.
So he was a friend of Gary's as well.
Yes, he
No.
was.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Robinson, I just had one question regarding the bank that you worked at. Was it ever your responsibility to talk with Mr. Robinson about the loans he was approving?
No, it was not.
Nothing further, Your Honor. May this witness be excused?
Yes. All right, call your next witness, please.
The plaintiff calls Rufus Pennington to the stand.
All right, Mr. Pennington, please take the stand.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Pennington. Please state your name and spell your last for the record.
My name is Rufus Pennington, Pennington.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by talking about what you do for a living. What is your job?
I'm an aircraft mechanic.
Where do you work as an aircraft mechanic?
I work here in Armadillo at the airport.
What got you started in that line of work?
As a child, I loved being at the airport and being around airports.
Mr. Pennington, does it require any sort of education to be an aircraft mechanic?
Yes, it does.
What kind of education did you receive?
I graduated from Sam Daniels.
You mentioned you graduated in 2001, so how many years of experience now do you have?
I have 7 years of experience.
Mr. Pennington, I'd like to switch gears a little and talk about how you got involved in today's case. Why are you here?
Gary Robinson died in a plane crash, and I'm here.
Did you take any steps to prepare for your appearance in court today?
Yes, I did.
Did your education help you prepare for your appearance in court today?
Yes, it did.
How so?
During my time at Sam Daniels, I learned a lot about the
Did your work experience help you to prepare for your testimony in court today?
Yes, it did.
How so?
During my 7 years of experience, I've seen
Mr. Pennington, you mentioned that you were able to visit the crash site. When you did that, were you able to see Mr. Robinson's plane?
Yes, I was.
And did you apply what you've learned in your education and experience when you were looking at that plane?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff tenders Rufus Pennington as an expert in the field of aircraft mechanics pursuant to Federal Rule of Evidence 702.
Any objection?
May I briefly, Your Honor?
Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Pennington. You are an aircraft mechanic.
Yes, that's correct.
You went to aviation repair school
Yes, I did.
right after you graduated from high school.
Yes, that is correct.
You graduated from high school in the year 2000.
Yes, that's correct.
You graduated from aviation repair school in the year 2001.
Correct.
Your Honor, at this time, defense objects to Mr. Pennington being tendered as an expert witness under Rule 702A because they do not have the requisite knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education to testify as an expert in today's case. I have just elicited testimony from Mr. Pennington that his aviation repair program was only 1 year long. And although Mr. Pennington has years of experience following his education, given that his education has been so short that experience based in that education is not sufficient for him to be tendered as an expert witness today under Rule 702A.
The basis of your objection is primarily his education?
Yes, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Mr. Pennington, I'd like to move on. Before we talk about the details of the plane crash, you had mentioned Gary Robinson. I'd like to know, who is Gary Robinson to you?
Gary Robinson was a good friend. I also frequently worked on Gary Robinson's aircraft.
You mentioned you taught him how to fly, so how familiar are you with how he flew an airplane?
Very familiar.
From what you observed, could Mr. Robinson fly a plane by the time you finished training him?
Yes, he did.
And after he became a pilot, did you ever see Mr. Robinson fly a plane again?
Yes, I did on multiple.
And after you trained him to become a pilot, did you ever interact with him again?
Yes, I did. I also worked on Gary's aircraft.
When did you work on Gary's aircraft?
Including a week prior to his crash.
Let's back up and talk about that a little bit. What maintenance did you do on the plane the week before the crash?
A week before the crash, I replaced some of the hoses on Gary's right. And despite being tempted to tinker with a few other things,
You mentioned you were tempted to tinker with a few other things. Why is that?
I had read an article in an aviation journal that I frequently rely on, and it had mentioned some issues with the switch.
What is that aviation journal?
That journal is Flyway, Engineering by Flyway.
Is that a source of information that people in your field would rely upon for technical information?
Yes, it is.
And would you recognize a copy if I showed it to you today?
Yes, I would.
Permission to approach the witness with what has been marked as Exhibit 1.
You may approach.
Mr. Pennington, what did I just hand you?
This is the Flyway Journal of Aviation.
Do you see a volume number anywhere on that article?
Yes, it is volume 27.
And do you see a publication date on that journal?
Yes, it is June of 2004.
Can you tell us who the author is?
The author is Mike.
And is this a fair and accurate copy of that article as you remember seeing it?
Yes, it is.
Has it been altered in any way?
No, it is not.
The plaintiff moves to admit Exhibit 1 into evidence at this time.
Any objections?
Yes, Your Honor, at this time, the defense raises their arguments from motions in limine under federal rules of evidence 801, 404, and 405.
Witness has been accepted as an expert and has kind of information that experts in the field so far overrule the objection and admit the exhibit.
Mr. Pennington, I'd like to talk about what in that article made you tempted to fiddle with other things in Mr. Robinson's plane. What is that article talking about?
The article is discussing many issues that have been reported about FlightWorthy's automatic fuel pump switch.
What is an automatic fuel pump switch?
It was a safety mechanism installed in FlightWorthy aircrafts that was supposed to keep pilots safe.
How is it supposed to keep pilots safe?
Well, as the name suggests, it's an automatic switch that would take fuel from the auxiliary, excuse me, my apologies. The automatic switch would bring fuel from the, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. How was this automatic fuel pump switch intended to keep pilots safe?
Yes, so as the name suggests, the automatic fuel pump switch would cause the auxiliary fuel pump switch to engage, which would then revive a dead engine.
So according to the article, is there a problem with that?
Yes, so if the automatic fuel pumps at the same time as the engine, it would cause the engine to flood.
Now, Mr. Pennington, you mentioned earlier today that you observed that crash site of Mr. Robinson's plane. Why did you do that?
I wanted to see if I could see what had happened in the mechanics of the plane.
And what, if anything, were you able to observe?
I was able to observe the plane was 50 feet down the runway, nose down.
Did you learn anything else about the plane?
Yes, I did.
What did you learn?
I learned that the right propeller was pushed flat against the engine cowling and the left propeller was twisted into a corkscrew.
When that happens in a plane, what can that mean?
It might suggest that the right engine was not running at the time of impact and the left engine was.
Did you look at anything else on the plane?
I did.
What did you look at?
I looked for the automatic fuel pump switch as well as the manual fuel pump switch.
Let's talk about those switches and let's break them down one by one. First, I'd like to talk about the automatic fuel pump switch. Were you able to see the automatic fuel pump switch?
I was not. The
Why?
plane was too badly burned.
Now let's talk about that manual switch. Were you able to see the manual switch?
Yes, I was.
Now what position was the manual switch in?
The manual switch was in the on position.
Mr. Pennington, what is the purpose of the manual switch?
The manual switch is the switch that would ignite revive a dead engine.
No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination.
Hello again, Mr. Pennington. I would like to start by briefly discussing the Flyboy magazine article that was brought up during direct examination. Permission to approach the witness with what has already been admitted as exhibit 1. Mr. Pennington, in this article, Flightworthy Aircraft Company denies knowledge of their automatic fuel pump switch failing.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Permission to retrieve the exhibit, Your Honor. Mr. Pennington, I'd now like to discuss your relationships with the Robinsons. You knew Mr. Robinson.
Yes, I did. We've been good friends for a while.
You were his mechanic.
Yes, that's correct.
You also taught Mr. Robinson how to fly.
Yes, I did.
You also know Mrs. Robinson.
Yes, I did.
You began dating Mrs. Robinson.
After Gary's death, yes, I did.
So after Mr. Robinson's crash,
Yes, that's correct.
you investigated Mr. Robinson's crash?
I did.
Okay, I would like to talk a little bit more about your conclusions regarding the cause of Mr. Robinson's crash. You concluded there was a problem with the aircraft.
Yes, I did.
You concluded that the automatic fuel pump switch failed.
I did.
A failure which could lead to the engine flooding.
That is correct.
The aircraft also has a manual fuel pump switch,
Yes, that is correct.
which can be manually turned on.
Yes, that would be the first step. That would revive a dead engine.
So it can be turned on by the pilot.
That's correct. That's the safety mechanism.
Turning this on at the wrong time could also lead to the engine flooding,
That is correct.
which would result in a crash.
That is correct.
Mr. Robinson asked you about the manual switch.
Yes, during our discussion of the Flyboy article that talked about the issues with the switch.
So he did ask you specifically about the manual switch.
Yes, he did.
He asked if deliberately turning on the manual switch could lead to the engine flooding.
Objection under 801 and 404A1.
I'll repeat my last question. He asked if deliberately turning on the manual switch could lead to the engine flooding.
Yes, he did.
You answered his question about the switch.
I did. We were having a discussion.
Turning on the manual switch while the engine pump is working could lead to the engine flooding.
That is correct.
Okay, let's move on to your examination of Mr. Robinson's plane following his crash. You examined the crash site.
I did.
The plane was nose down in the ground.
Yes, it was.
You looked at the automatic fuel pump switch.
I looked for it. Yes, that is correct.
That part of the plane was pretty burned up.
Yes, it was too badly burned to be able to find the switch.
So you could not tell what position it was in.
No, I could not.
You could not tell if it was in the on position?
No, I could not.
You looked at the manual switches for the auxiliary fuel pumps?
Yes, I did.
The manual fuel pump switch was flipped to the on position?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, Mr. Pennington, I now would like to discuss the day of Mr. Robinson's crash. You are familiar with Mrs. Robinson.
Yes, we've all been good friends for a while.
You saw her the evening of Mr. Robinson's crash.
Yes, I did.
You were at the Robinson residence that evening.
Yes, I was.
You were present when Mrs. Robinson learned about the crash.
I was.
Mrs. Robinson appeared to be in shock.
Yes, she was very shocked.
She said she was afraid Gary would do something like this.
Yes, that's correct.
You've been in contact with Mrs. Robinson since Mr. Robinson's crash.
Yes, I have.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Can you redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Pennington, I'd just like to ask you 2 more questions. When Miss Gabriella Robinson said she was afraid her husband would do something like this, what was her demeanor like?
She was incredibly shocked. She had just learned her husband had passed.
I'd like to ask you one more question about that manual fuel pump switch. Why might a pilot hit that switch?
In the event of engine failure, that switch would revive the dead end.
No further questions at this time. May I retrieve the exhibit and may the witness be excused?
Yes, and yes. All right, any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor, this time the plaintiff rests.
All right, defendant, you may start your case. Call your first witness.
Your Honor, may we make a motion?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, pursuant to Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 50A, defense moves for a judgment as a matter of law, even when viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the non-moving party, in this case the plaintiff. No reasonable jury could find that flightworthy aircraft designed, manufactured, or marketed a defective plane that was the producing cause of Mr. Robinson's death. Today, there has not been enough evidence to establish that there existed a defect in Mr. Robinson's plane. Any testimony elicited today about the automatic fuel pump switch failing pertains to models that Mr. Robinson was not piloting. Further, even if there were a defect in Mr. Robinson's plane, no evidence has been presented today that establishes that that part of the plane caused Mr. Robinson's crash. We heard testimony today from Rufus Pennington that he was not able to determine what the state of the automatic fuel pump switch was. Therefore, any conclusions, and his conclusion stating that the automatic fuel pump switch failed is unfounded based on what has been presented in court today. Therefore, no reasonable jury would be able to find for the plaintiff, and the judgment as a matter of the law should be granted.
Response from the defendant?
Yes, Your Honor. May I walk to the podium?
Yes.
Under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 50A, viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the non-moving party, which is today us, the plaintiff, a reasonable juror could still absolutely find in our favor. For the plaintiff to receive a verdict in our favor today, we must prove that Flightworthy Aircraft Company had a design, marketing, or manufacturing defect that was the producing cause of Mr. Robinson's death. At this point in time, we have established that element. First, we provided evidence of a marketing defect through our witness, Mr. Rufus Pennington, an expert in aircraft mechanics. Mr. Pennington stated in court today that an article was written discussing criticisms about the Flightworthy Aircraft Company's automatic fuel pump switch, and that these criticisms were serious enough that it prompted him to want to actively do mechanics on Mr. Robinson's plane prior to the crash. Mr. Pennington stated that critics were concerned that the automatic fuel pump switch could fail, thereby flooding an engine or potentially causing a crash. This article provided evidence of a marketing defect on the part of Flightworthy, in the sense that Flightworthy Aircraft Company was put on notice of a possible defect, possibly deadly defect, that is, in their airplanes, and did nothing to investigate the problem or warn pilots. Second, we have also provided evidence today of both a manufacturing and design defect. Mr. Pennington stated on the stand today that if the automatic fuel pump activates at the wrong time, it can cause the auxiliary fuel pump to activate even when the engine-driven fuel pump is already working, which can cause the engine to have too much fuel in it and quit. Mr. Pennington also told you today that his examination of Mr. Robinson's crash site suggested that one of the engines was not running at the time of impact, suggesting that it had flooded and quit. This sequence of events is significant evidence of a design or manufacturing defect in Flightworthy's aircrafts. Thus, the plaintiff has met our burden by a preponderance of the evidence during our case in chief. As such, we ask that you deny this motion for a judgment as a matter of law.
Sorry. Normally I would take such a motion under advisement and not rule at the time, but given the exercise, I will deny defendant's motion. Despite very good points. All right. Defendants, you may call your witness, please. Yes. Oh, okay. I'm told we can have a recess. So why don't we take a 10-minute recess? We'll be back at 20 minutes, or, let's see that clock. 6:30. Right.
All right. Be seated.
but the judge admitted, so we're gonna say.
All rise.
All right, please be seated.
Proceed with the defense case.
Yes, Your Honor. That's called Tracy Lee to stand.
All right. All right.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, good evening. Ms. Leduc, I'd like to begin by discussing some introductory information about yourself. Can you please state your name and spell your last for the record?
Yes, my name is Tracy Leduc.
Where do you live, Ms. Leduc?
I live in Armadillo, right off Hindsight Street.
And what do you do for a living in Armadillo?
I'm a state banking examiner.
How long have you been in that position?
Just about 2 years now.
And who is your employer?
I work for the Banking Commission of the state of Boulder.
What is your educational background?
I graduated from the University of Lone Star with a bachelor's degree in art history.
With a degree in art history, how did you end up in your current position?
Well, I needed to find a way to make ends meet, and believe it or not, there's not much work for an art history major here in Armadillo. So I decided to start working for the Banking Commission.
Did you receive any training?
Yes, I did.
What training was that?
Well, when I started working, I was taught how to look at loan records so I could better identify irregularities.
Now, Ms. Leduc, I'd like to briefly talk about your relationship with Mr. Robinson. How did you know Mr. Robinson?
We first met when I was sent to his bank on occasion to look at loan transactions.
How well did you know Mr. Robinson?
We were very close. I considered him to be a close friend.
What was the nature of your relationship with Mr. Robinson?
At first, it started out strictly professional, and over time, we got to be close friends. At a certain point, we began a romantic relationship.
How did this romantic relationship begin?
After several visits to his bank, he approached me and suggested that he follow me to spend some time.
Did you go flying with Mr. Robinson?
Yes, I did.
Where would he take you?
We would go to several small towns. Sometimes we take a trip to Smallville, and sometimes we go to Newville.
What would you do on these trips with Mr. Robinson?
We would usually go somewhere private in town.
How did these trips affect your relationship with Mr. Robinson?
We got very close over time. It was a pretty romantic guy.
How long did you and Mr. Robinson carry on in this capacity?
I don't know the exact time, but the relationship ended 2 weeks prior to this.
Who ended the relationship?
Gary did after his wife found out.
All right, Ms. Leduc, now I'd like to discuss why you're here today. What is your familiarity with the Armadillo State Bank?
I'm very familiar with that bank.
Why is that?
Well, I was sent there on several occasions by the banking commission to look at the bank's loan transactions.
Why were you sent there by the banking commission?
Well, Mr. Robinson was a loan provider for many technology startup companies.
Is that abnormal?
Not by itself, no.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the terms of the loans were somewhat concerning.
What were the terms of the loans?
Many of the loans were made without the borrower making any down payment, yet Mr. Robinson would finance 100% of the requested amount.
What does that mean for the jury?
It means that the bank would finance all the money without having the borrower make any upfront fee.
Did the bank keep records of these loans?
No.
How did you know that?
From what I observed, most of the loans lack proper documentation.
Who else knew about this?
The president of the bank, David Robinson.
How did he know?
During my time there, I would go into his office and ask him about the loans that the bank was issuing.
What would happen during these meetings with Mr. Robinson?
Well, he would offer me tea and cookies and tell me any concerns that I had.
Ms. Leduc, I'd now like to talk about what was happening at the bank in the weeks leading up to Mr. Robinson's crash. In those weeks, did you continue your work at the bank?
Yes, I did.
What did you do?
Well, I continued looking into transactions with banking.
What did you discover in those weeks?
I discovered many additional loans that lack proper documentation.
Did you tell Mr. Robinson about your discoveries?
Yes, I did.
When did you tell Mr. Robinson about these discoveries?
The day before his phone crash.
What happened?
Well, I confronted him about the issues that he had tried to explain way earlier in the year.
Why did you confront Mr. Robinson?
I was going to have no choice but to declare the loans as bad and call the FBI. I gave him a heads up out of courtesy.
How did he react to that news?
He seemed pretty angry.
Why did you think that?
He said I was trying to ruin his banking's reputation and he can stand if he lost both of those things.
Objection under Rule 801 and 404.
Overruled.
How did the banking commission respond to your discoveries?
It made the Bank of Armadillo write the loans off.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Ms. Leduc. I'd like to clarify a few things that you said on direct examination. You said your relationship with Mr. Robinson went beyond purely professional.
At a certain point, yes.
You said he was very romantic.
Yeah, he was pretty romantic.
He took you flying in his airplane.
Yes, he did.
He took you flying in his airplane more than once, didn't he?
Correct.
You would take trips to other cities together.
Yep.
For example, you took trips to Smallville.
That's correct.
You took trips to New Deal.
Correct.
And after the first couple of trips, you would go to places together privately
On those trips, yeah, we would listen private.
to discuss banking.
Yeah,
You are a state bank examiner, right?
that's correct.
In fact, you work for the Banking Commission of the state of Lone Star.
Correct.
You conduct examinations of banks in the Lone Star area.
Correct.
And Armadillo State Bank is one of those banks that you examine.
Correct.
In fact, that's the bank Mr. Robinson owned, right?
Yes.
Mr. Robinson made a lot of startup company loans, didn't he?
Yes.
And you discussed those loans with Mr. Robinson?
I did, that's why I was sent to his bank.
And you would do so in a private setting, right?
As was required, yes.
Over tea and cookies?
Well, he would offer me the tea and cookies and days whenever it happens.
Right, so you had concerns about Mr. Robinson's loans, didn't you?
Correct.
But he would always somehow explain them away.
That's correct.
Bank examiners regularly conduct bank examination reports, don't they?
Yes,
And you examined some of Mr. Robinson's loans in a report?
I did.
Let's take a look at some of those loans that you examined. Your Honor, I'm showing opposing counsel a clean and unmarked copy of what has been marked as Exhibit 2. This was stipulated to be admissible pending proper foundation. Permission to approach the witness the same?
Yes.
Ms. Leduc, you recognize Exhibit 2, right?
I did.
This is a report of a bank examination that you conducted yourself.
Correct.
These types of reports are a regularly conducted business activity for bank examiners, right?
Yes.
And that's an examination of the Armadillo State Bank.
Yes.
It says Armadillo State Bank at the top.
It does.
Your name is also at the top.
It is.
And your signature is at the bottom.
Correct.
Your Honor, at this time, plaintiff moves to formally admit Exhibit 2 into evidence.
Okay, any objections?
No objections, yes.
Exhibit 2 is admitted.
And permission to constructively publish to the jury. Thank you. This report includes 3 of Mr. Robinson's loans, right?
Correct.
And those 3 loans were randomly selected for your review.
They were.
Ms. Leduc, I'd like to direct your attention to loan number 1 first. Mr. Robinson was using this loan for small business capitalization.
Yes, that's what it says.
And for this loan, Mr. Robinson had collateral, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you ultimately found that loan number 1 was a sound loan.
That's what the report says.
Now let's look at loan number 2. This loan was for capitalization of a mortgage loan entity, right?
Correct.
Mr. Robinson had collateral for this loan too, right?
Yes.
And you ultimately found that loan number 3 was a sound loan.
Yes.
Finally, let's look at loan number 3. This loan was to cover cash flow issues.
Yes.
The loan issuer was Enron, right?
Yes.
And Enron is a natural gas trading company, right?
I'm unsure, but I will.
Mr. Leduc, it says in the report, in your own words, that,
Yes.
okay. And Enron is a multinational company.
Yes.
And its CEO personally gave Mr. Robinson a guarantee as collateral, right?
Yes.
And you ultimately found that loan number 3 was a sound loan.
Yes.
Those are the only 3 loans you examined in this report, right?
In this report, yes.
And all 3 of them were found to be sound.
At the time, yes.
About 2 weeks before his death, Mr. Robinson broke off your romantic relationship, right?
That was the timeline.
And after Mr. Robinson broke up with you, you continued examining his loans?
I did.
And it was only at that time that you decided his loans were questionable enough to get the FBI involved.
Information comes up with it.
So, Ms. Leduc, that's a yes to my question. Only after Mr. Robinson broke up with you did you decide to get the FBI involved on his bank?
Yes.
No further questions.
Redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
Ms. Leduc, on cross-examination, there was a little bit of discussion about a bank examination report that you wrote. Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with what has already been admitted is Exhibit 2. Ms. Leduc, what loans did you examine in this report?
I wrote the report on 3 randomly selected loans that the bank had issued.
Were these the only loans issued by the Armadillo State Bank?
No, the bank issued one.
Were those 3 loans representative of the bank's stability as a whole?
No.
Why not?
Well, several of the bank's other loans were found as bad loans.
No further questions, Your Honor. Permission to retrieve my exhibit.
Yes, you may.
And may this witness be.
Yes. All right. The defense call your next witness, please.
At this time, the defense calls Dusty Stalker to stand.
Good evening, Mr. Stockard. Could you please state your name and spell your last for the record?
My name is Dusty Stockard, S-T-O-C-R-D.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Stockard?
I'm an engineer at the Aircraft Company.
What type of work do you do there?
I'm an aeronautical engineer that works in
What do you primarily do on a daily basis working in that division?
I design the electrical components and the switches for the planes that they make.
How long have you been doing that?
15 years.
What qualifications do you have to do that work?
I obtained an aeronautical engineering degree from the Lone Star Institute of Technology.
Why are you here today?
I conducted an investigation into Mr. Robinson's plane crash.
Did you form a conclusion at the end of your investigation?
Yes.
Did you use your training and education to come to this conclusion?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense tenders Mr. Stockard as an expert in aeronautical engineering pursuant to Federal Rule of Evidence 702.
Any objection?
Brief voir dire, Your Honor.
All right.
Mr. Stockard, I just have a few questions about your qualifications. You don't have any education in crash site investigation, do you?
I do not.
You don't have any training in crash site investigation?
No.
You don't know what the proper method of investigating a crash site is, do you?
I conduct my investigations according to flight protocols.
I'm not talking about flight-worthy protocols in Stockard. I'm just asking you if you know the proper method to investigate a crash site.
I guess I do not.
It's not a routine part of your job to investigate crash sites, is it?
I conduct these investigations.
So it's not a routine part of your job.
No.
In fact, you only investigate crash sites when there's a question of engine failure.
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we don't have an objection to this witness being tendered as an expert in aviation, but specifically under Rule 702, a witness may be qualified by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education. And this witness has just testified to having none of those specific traits pursuant to any skills in investigating a crash site. And pursuant to Rule 702C, this witness has not testified to knowing any sort of reliable methods or principles upon which to base his investigation. So we'd request limiting the scope of this witness's testimony to just aviation and not crash site investigation.
All right. Response, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. During voir dire, Dusty Stockard testified that he does conduct investigations as a part of his job, and he has also testified during direct that he applied his degree when he was conducting this investigation. His aeronautical engineering degree is how he understood the things he saw at the crash site, and therefore that is well within the scope of his expertise as an aeronautical engineer.
Okay. The witness will be accepted as I will reserve ruling on specific questions with regard to crash site analysis.
Now that we've covered some of your qualifications, I'd like to move on and discuss some of the designs you create every day at your job. What types of planes do you typically work with?
I'm very familiar with the flight-worthy twin series model.
And what type of plane was Mr. Robinson flying?
Just that, the flight-worthy twin series model.
Why is this a model that you're familiar with?
I designed all the switches on that plane.
What do you know about something called the automatic auxiliary fuel pump switch?
That's one of the switches on the plane that I designed. I like to call it the automatic switch for brevity's sake.
So what does the automatic switch do?
The automatic switch is a safety feature installed in the plane that Mr. Robinson was flying.
What about it makes it a safety feature?
It keeps the pilot afloat. It keeps the pilot safe in the event of an engine failure.
What happens when an engine fails?
Well, this is where the automatic switch comes on. It turns on a backup fuel pump switch to keep the plane going.
What does a pilot have to do to turn this switch on?
The pilot doesn't have to do anything. The switch, the automatic switch, detects a problem on itself, all by itself, to keep the plane flying safely.
What does all of that mean in layman's terms?
Essentially, the automatic switch is a safety system installed in the plane to keep the plane flying safely in the event of an engine pump failure.
Okay, Mr. Stockard, now that we've got some of that more technical information sorted out, I'd like to discuss your investigation. What day did you begin your investigation?
January 16th, a day after the crash had occurred.
What did you do first in your investigation?
I was able to go to the crash site and look at the plane.
What specific parts of the plane were you able to observe?
I was able to look at the plane's controls, specifically the manual auxiliary fuel pump switch.
What is the manual auxiliary fuel pump switch?
It's another switch on the plane. This one I like to call the manual switch.
Where is the manual switch on the plane?
It's located in the cockpit with the other controls that the pilot might need.
What does this switch do?
It turns on a fuel pump.
What happens if this switch is pulled during takeoff?
The engine would be flooded because of the extra fuel coming from that pump, and the plane would flip.
Why would the plane flip?
Because of the extra force coming from one side of the plane, the engine that's still running.
Now I'd like to move on and discuss some more of your observations of the plane. Did you observe anything else about Mr. Robinson's plane?
Yes.
What did you observe?
I was able to look at the propellers on both the left and the right engines of the plane.
What did the propellers on the right side of the plane look like?
They were folded deeply back against the engine.
What did this tell you about the right engine of Mr. Robinson's plane?
This tells me that the right engine had failed during takeoff.
What did the left engine look like? The left propellers look like?
The left propellers were crumpled and twisted.
What did this tell you about the left engine of Mr. Robinson's plane?
This tells me that that engine was running properly during takeoff.
What could cause this to happen? The right engine being dead, but the left one still running?
The manual switch being turned on.
Now I'd like to circle back and ask you about any other investigation you completed outside of looking at the plane. What other information were you able to learn about Mr. Robinson's crash?
I am aware of an NTSB report filed on the crash.
And what is the NTSB?
The NTSB is an agency that is the National Transportation Safety Board. And they conduct investigations into these crashes, and they form a conclusion at the end of their report.
I'm showing opposing counsel what has been pre-marked as Exhibit 3 and stipulated as admissible. Permission to approach the witness?
Yes.
Do you recognize this document, Mr. Stockard?
Yes.
What is it?
It is the NTSB report filed on Mr. Robinson's crash.
And how do you recognize it?
I have read it.
Is it a true and accurate representation of the report you read?
Yes.
And did you rely on this report in coming to your conclusion?
Yes, I did.
At this time, the defense moves to admit Exhibit 3 and constructively publish to the jury.
All right. Exhibit 3 was paragraph 3 will be, paragraph 3 will be redacted, and then Exhibit 3 is admitted.
What is significant about this NTSB report to you?
It formed a conclusion as to why Mr. Robinson's plane went down.
What was the conclusion?
It stated that the probable cause of the accident was engine failure of an engine.
What is something that can cause a plane engine to fail?
Pilot turning on the manual switch.
What position was the manual switch on in Mr. Robinson's plane?
It was in the on position.
No further questions.
Cross-examination, counsel.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Stockard. I'd like to start by discussing what you do for Flightworthy Aircraft Company. You work for Flightworthy?
Yes.
You design electronic parts and switches for Flightworthy?
Yes.
The parts and switches you design for Flightworthy become parts of the planes the company manufactures.
Yes.
You believe that the parts and switches you design are safe.
Yes.
Testing a new design is an important step in knowing that the parts and designs that you make are safe.
Yes.
And that's important because pilots fly flight-worthy aircrafts.
Yes, of course.
So safety is a consideration as you design parts for aircrafts.
Yes, and that would be the purpose on top of that for the switches themselves.
Mr. Stockard, you just testified that safety is something you consider when designing. I'd like the jury to understand exactly how much you actually consider safety. You've said that engine failure is just a minor inconvenience.
This was in the deposition.
My question was just, you've said that engine failure is just a minor inconvenience.
Yes.
You've said that some pilots get in planes without knowing proper emergency techniques.
Yes.
But Mr. Stockard, you're not a pilot, are you?
I am not.
You've never learned how to fly an aircraft?
I have not.
So you don't know what emergency techniques a pilot learns.
I do not.
Despite not knowing the emergency techniques a pilot learns, you believe pilots who get into these planes without knowing proper emergency techniques are just bent on suicide.
Objection.
Isn't that right?
What's the objection? We stipulated that Dusty Stockard would not mention suicide.
Your Honor, may I respond, Your Honor?
Briefly.
I believe the stipulation was specific to conclusions regarding the plane crash.
Yes, you may respond.
This would be outside the scope of this witness's expertise to opine on suicide.
May I briefly respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
This line of questioning, and it's the last question I have in the chapter, Your Honor, is specifically going to this witness's bias during investigations. I didn't mention Gary Robinson's plane at all, Your Honor.
Sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. In this case, Mr. Stockard, you concluded that Mr. Robinson caused his plane to crash?
Yes.
Let's talk about that conclusion. You went to the scene the day after the crash?
Yes.
Investigating crashes isn't a routine part of your job, is it?
No.
In fact, you only get involved if there's a question of engine failure.
Yes.
For your investigation, you walked around and looked at the airplane?
Yes.
The plane was pretty burned up after the crash?
Yes.
Despite how burned up the plane was, you still found the manual auxiliary pump switch. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Let's talk about what you saw when you found that manual switch. The plane hit the ground hard when it crashed?
Yes.
When that happens, all sorts of things fly around inside an airplane.
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm showing opposing counsel a clean and unmarked copy of what has been admitted as Exhibit 3. Permission to approach the witness with the same? Mr. Stockard, this is the NTSB report you were just talking about on direct examination. Isn't that right?
Yes.
If I could direct your attention to the second to last sentence of the first paragraph, just let me know when you're there.
Yes.
It reads, "The aircraft was extensively damaged by the fire that resulted from the crash." Did I get that right?
Yes.
And little could be ascertained from a close examination of the engines or the cockpit area. Did I read that right?
Yes.
The next sentence reads, "It appeared that some of the controls had become dislodged or modified as a result of that crash."
Yes.
Finally, if I could direct your attention to the last sentence of the second paragraph, just let me know when you're there.
Yes.
That sentence reads, "Flightworthy Company aircraft representative Dusty Stockard was present at the site of the crash, but said he had no opinion about the aircraft or the crash." Right?
Yes.
You never told anyone that some of the controls had become dislodged, did you?
I did not.
You later concluded that Mr. Robinson flipped the manual switch, and that's why it was in the on position.
Yes.
Let's talk about what the automatic switch looked like during your investigation, Mr. Stockard. You don't know what position the automatic switch was in, do you?
I do not.
You don't know what position the automatic switch was in because you never looked for it. Isn't that right?
I couldn't see it due to the damage, excessive damage.
Mr. Stockard, I wasn't asking if you could see it. My question was just, you never even looked for it. Isn't that right?
Yes.
So you went to investigate a crashed flight-worthy aircraft for signs of engine failure and never even looked for the automatic switch that you invented?
That's true.
I'd like to learn how Flightworthy makes your automatic switch, Mr. Stockard. You outsource the manufacturing of the switch?
Yes.
You outsource the manufacturing to a place that makes it cheaper?
Yes, standard.
I wasn't asking if it was a standard business practice, Mr. Stockard, but just that you did, in fact, outsource the manufacturing of the switch to a place that makes it cheaper. And you did, right?
Yes.
You don't control the manufacturing plant of the place you outsourced it to, do you?
I do not.
You don't know what regulations they have?
No.
You don't know if they follow Flightworthy code?
No.
I want to know exactly how rigorously you've tested your automatic switch, Mr. Stockard. You can't show us any reports evaluating the chances of your switch failing?
I do not.
In fact, you've never done any testing about the chances that your switch could fail.
That is true.
You never did any testing to evaluate the chances of your switch failing because you're sure that your switch can't fail.
Yes.
But if your switch were to fail, and it turned on the auxiliary fuel pump at the same time the engine-driven pump was on, the engine might die, right?
Yes.
Let's shift gears a little, Mr. Stockard, and discuss your knowledge of any criticism regarding your automatic switch. You're familiar with Flightworthy's service bulletins?
Yes.
The company sends out a service bulletin anytime there's some kind of an issue with an airplane that might cause a safety concern, right?
Yes.
To your knowledge, that's the only time that your company sends out a service bulletin.
Yes.
You're aware of a service bulletin draft regarding your automatic switch?
Yes.
Despite knowledge of that draft, you still never did any research evaluating the chances of your switch failing.
I do not.
Surely, as the inventor of that switch, you reviewed that draft.
Yes.
Despite reviewing the draft, you still never did any research evaluating the chances of your switch failing. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I'd like the jury to learn if anyone within Flightworthy has criticized your switch. Naysayers at Flightworthy have questioned your automatic switch.
Yes.
You don't know who they are.
No.
You never tried to find out.
No.
You don't know what criticism they had regarding your switch. You don't know if they had any control over your job.
No.
Despite knowing people within your company criticized your switch, you still never did any research evaluating the chances of your switch failing. Isn't that right? Let me ask that one more time, Mr. Stockard. Despite knowing people within your company had criticized your switch, you still never did any research evaluating the chances of your switch failing.
That is true.
In fact, because people within your company criticized your switch, you wrote a service bulletin. Isn't that right?
Yes.
The service bulletin you wrote was issued to the public?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Were you at council?
Yes, Your Honor, briefly.
Yes.
Next.
Yes.
Hello again, Mr. Stockard. Now, cross-examination, they just finished up asking you about a bulletin that you wrote that was sent out. What planes did that bulletin pertain to?
The Twin Series model.
And what plane was Mr. Robinson flying that day?
The Twin Series Model 7.
And on cross-examination, there was some discussion about what would happen if the automatic switch failed. What led you to conclude that the manual switch was pulled rather than the automatic switch failing?
I would just look at the evidence and see the manual switch in the on position and the way the plane flipped over.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you.
May this witness be dismissed?
Yes. All right, any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor, at this time, the defense.
All right, do we have any motions at this time?
Your Honor, we would rest on our prior arguments for the judgment.
Okay, thank you. All right, are we ready to proceed to closing?
Your Honor, could we have a few minutes to prepare?
How many minutes?
Is 5 minutes okay, Your Honor?
Yes. All right, we'll recess for 5 minutes.
All rise. All rise.
All right, please be seated. All right, are we ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, I request 3 minutes for rebuttal.
All right. Somebody. You don't want me to be one to be time.
We have timekeepers, Your Honor, thank you.
All right.
May I proceed?
Yes.
An irresponsible company and its narcissistic engineer. The automatic switch was never foolproof. When Gary Robinson took off from the Smallville airport on January 15, 2005, he did so with confidence. After all, he had nothing to worry about. He was in his trusted flight-worthy aircraft and had his 5 years of piloting experience in his back pocket. So he knew everything was going to be okay. So when the right engine in his plane started to fail, Mr. Robinson stayed confident. In just moments, the automatic auxiliary fuel pump would turn on and the engine would come back to life. You heard it yourself. The automatic switch is foolproof. But on January 15, 2005, it wasn't. This time, the engine stayed dead. As the seconds mounted, Gary Robinson's confidence turned to confusion. And as his plane started to nosedive, his confusion turned to horror. For Flightworthy Aircraft Company, Gary Robinson's death was just the cost of innovation. Don't let the defense distract you. This case is a story about Flightworthy's automatic auxiliary fuel pump switch. A switch that cost Gary Robinson his life. At the start of this trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Stenholm, explained that as a plaintiff, we had the burden of proving by a preponderance of the evidence that Flightworthy had a manufacturing, marketing, or design defect, and that that defect was a producing cause of Gary Robinson's death. And we met that burden. A producing cause is a cause that substantially results in injury, without which the injury likely would not have occurred. And we showed you that Flightworthy's automatic switch was defective and they did nothing about it. We met the burden of showing you the cause. But the defense has also taken on a burden in this case. They're arguing that Mr. Robinson committed suicide. And remember, they have to prove that same burden by a preponderance of the evidence. So what they're telling you is that Mr. Robinson, who was flying a Flightworthy plane with an untested and defective Flightworthy switch, was more responsible for his death than the company was. That's what you're going to have to decide. Who's responsible? Finally, preponderance of the evidence just means more likely than not. Members of the jury, there's nothing in this case that's merely more likely than not. We know that Flightworthy's automatic switch was defective. We know that despite mounting pressure, Dusty Stalker never once tested that automatic switch. And we know that because Flightworthy can't justify the automatic switch, they're relying on convincing you that Mr. Robinson killed himself. Let's consider what we've heard today. We'll start with the plane Mr. Robinson is flying. Imagine a pilot flying a Flightworthy plane. Normally, engine-driven fuel pumps drive fuel to the engines on the plane, which then runs the right and left pellets. But it's critical that the engine always has access to fuel. So Flightworthy includes an auxiliary fuel pump, just to make sure. The way these fuel pumps work are really clear. Pilots have access to two switches, a right manual switch and a left manual switch. So far, so good. That's where the automatic switch comes in. Under the guise of helping pilots, Mr. Stockard creates an unnecessary automatic auxiliary fuel pump switch. In the event that the engine-driven pumps fail, Mr. Stockard's automatic switch would automatically cause the auxiliary fuel pumps to run and supply the engine with fuel. At first, this automatic switch is exactly what Flightworthy claims it is. The company's latest example of their commitment to protecting pilots. But take a closer look, and you'll realize that the automatic switch doesn't protect pilots, it punishes them. You heard Mr. Stockard admit that if his automatic switch failed, the engine would flood with fuel and suddenly die. Remember, if you're a pilot in that situation, you'd have no reason to believe the automatic switch had failed. You would just think the engine had died. So you would push the right manual switch and be in the on position that nothing would happen. The engine would stay dead. Dusty Stockard never did any testing on his automatic switch, and he should have. He told Flightworthy that his switch can't fail, and the company believed him. It's why they're so hesitant to admit of any problems with the switch, and try to clarify which planes and which models the switch was on. But Mr. Stockard knew there were problems with the switch and did nothing. You saw Exhibit 1, the Aviation Journal article, which was published over a year before Mr. Robinson's death. When Mr. Pennington saw that journal article, he was immediately tempted to tinker with the switch, maybe to remove it. Because the entire article discusses potential problems with the automatic switch. But what did Flightworthy do when they were made aware of those problems? They blamed the pilot. But hey, don't take my word for it, take Mr. Stockard's. Instead of testing the switch, or providing data or science supporting the switch, his words could not be more clear. Engine failure is just a minor inconvenience. Some pilots, hey, they just don't know proper emergency technique. Of course, how could he have provided them with data? He never did the research. But it wasn't just that exact article. Mr. Stockard was made aware over and over again of potential problems with the switch, and at every step of the way continued to do nothing. First, it was a service bulletin draft within his company. He knew the draft was regarding his switch, and he knew that he reviewed it. Any reasonable engineer who actually cared about safety would then address those problems, or at the very least try to prove that the switch had no problems. But not Mr. Stockard. He continues to believe that his switch can't fail, and never did a single thing after being put on notice that there was a draft regarding his switch. But it wasn't just the draft. Naysayers within Flightworthy started to realize there were problems and started criticizing Mr. Stockard's switch. But even then, nothing from Mr. Stockard. He could have tried finding those naysayers and dealt with this entire matter internally. But he didn't. And instead, he wrote a service bulletin, which he admitted is only issued if there's safety concerns on a plane, to the public. That's what he chose to do. The switch was defective and Flightworthy knew it. Finally, let's talk about Tracy LeDuc, the banking examiner who was investigating Mr. Robinson's bank before he died. Remember, Flightworthy could have found data scientists or researchers or other engineers to evaluate the chances of that automatic switch failure. But that was never an option for them. Because if they actually did a third-party reporting, the report would tell them the switch was defective. So instead, their entire case rests on convincing you that Mr. Robinson was so angry that his bank was being investigated that he committed suicide. Surely, if they could convince you that he committed suicide, then they would show you more than one piece of evidence that his bank was in danger, that he was angry. Just because you're angry does not mean you're committing suicide. And remember, they have to convince you that beyond a reasonable doubt. That's all they've got. Their first line of defense is to tell you that Mr. Robinson should have landed a defective plane with one engine. Their last line of defense is to tell you that Mr. Robinson committed suicide. For companies like Flightworthy Aircraft Company, the only thing that matters is their money and their reputation. Victims like Gary Robinson are just unfortunate accidents. If the company isn't held liable today, Mr. Robinson won't be the last. In just a few minutes, you will be asked to return to your jury room where you'll consider everything you've heard in today's trial. You'll then be given a jury form, which is page 39 of your trial packet. I have a few questions on it. First, was there a marketing, manufacturing, or design defect that was a producing cause of Gary Robinson's death? And there was. Flightworthy knew their switch was defective and did nothing. That's a manufacturing defect. Mr. Stalker was put on notice over and over again that there were problems with the switch and did nothing and didn't tell anyone. That's a marketing defect. So answer yes. Next, did the negligence, if any, of Gary Robinson cause the occurrence in question? It didn't. It wasn't Mr. Robinson's job to land a plane with one engine. It was Flightworthy's responsibility to give him a plane that was safe. So answer no. If you do that, then the last question you have to answer is question number 4. Did Gary Robinson commit suicide? He didn't. The only evidence they can point to is investigations on his plane. They can't point to other instances of him being a bad pilot. He'd been one for 5 years. He'd flown countless times. All they've got is the bank and Mr. Robinson being angry. That's not enough. Answer no. If you do that, your job here is done. But let's talk about question number 3. If you believe Mr. Robinson deserves some of the blame and answered yes to question 2, it's at most 1%. That 1% is for reading that Flyboy journal, asking Mr. Pennington about that manual switch, and not immediately acting. That's the 1%. But remember, Flightworthy always knew their switch was defective and did nothing. They get the other 99%. In just a second, you're going to hear defense counsel give their closing arguments. And as you listen, I just ask that you remember that in this case, the defendant is an irresponsible company. They have a narcissistic engineer. The automatic switch was never foolproof. Thank you.
And for the closing argument of the defense.
A failing bank, a forsaken affair, and a flipped switch. Mr. Robinson, he's the man at the center of this case today. And you all got to learn a lot about him. And by all means, he was an ambitious man, deeply involved in his community. But you also got the chance to hear about his failing bank, his failing marriage, and the fact that that reputation was beginning to crumble. Now, there was also testimony regarding the plane accident. However, by now, with all the evidence in front of you, it should be clear that that was no accident. Mr. Robinson got in his plane that day knowing he wasn't coming home because his mistakes had caught up to him. His bank was being investigated on the brink of closing, and his wife had figured out about his affair. Everything that he had worked so hard to achieve was beginning to unravel. So when he took off that day, he knew he wasn't going home. He knew he was going to flip that manual switch. Now, the events of today's case are a tragedy, but they are not Flightworthy's responsibility. Plaintiff has the burden of proving their claims today by a preponderance of the evidence. This means they have to prove their claims are more likely true than not. Now, to prove a product defect, which is what plaintiff is alleging, they have to show that Flightworthy produced a design, manufacturing, or marketing defect, and that this defect was the producing cause of Mr. Robinson's death. Now, producing cause simply means something is a substantial factor in bringing about the injuries, one without which the injuries would not have occurred. Now, plaintiff has not met this burden today, but it would not matter if they had, because in the state of Lone Star, an act of suicide breaks the chain of causation in a product's liability claim like this one. What does that mean? It means that even if they have proven their case today, which they have not, if you believe that Mr. Robinson committed suicide, then you must find that Flightworthy is not responsible. Walking back through the evidence and testimony you heard today, you'll see that it is sufficient to support our claims. Now, there was a lot of discussion today regarding Mr. Robinson's bank, the Armadillo State Bank. And it's important to note that not only was Mr. Robinson the owner of that bank, he was the president, the chief executive officer, and the chief financial officer of that bank. So when you walked into work every day, he's calling the shots. He runs the show at that bank. But we learned from Ms. LeDuc that unfortunately Mr. Robinson could not handle that stress. He had to start taking out bad loans to try and stay on top of everything. And it might have been fine if he hadn't been caught. But you heard what happened when Ms. LeDuc confronted him, when he realized his problems at the bank had been revealed. He was angry. The thought of losing his bank and his reputation all in one go, that was unbearable. And all of this happened one day before he got in that plane and never came back. Now, that wasn't the only secret that Mr. Robinson was struggling to keep. You learned today that prior to the crash, Mr. Robinson was having an affair with Ms. LeDuc and hiding it from his wife. The two met at the bank, and Mr. Robinson reeled Ms. LeDuc in with his charm, with his tea and cookies, in an identical fashion to how he met his wife of 30 years. And it's clear why Mr. Robinson was doing this. He knew he had problems at the bank, couldn't have Tracy finding out about them. So he got close to her, and instead spent a majority of his time explaining away any of her doubts and concerns. But unfortunately for Mr. Robinson, this wasn't sustainable. This wasn't something he could keep up. His wife figured out about the affair, and he was forced to end things with Ms. LeDuc. Now he was a man with not just a failing bank, but a failing marriage as well. The stress was too much to handle before, but at this point it was becoming unbearable. And the people in his life were beginning to take notice. Mrs. Robinson said it herself. The first words out of her mouth when she learned of this accident were she was afraid he would do something like this. Now, the testimony paints a picture of a man who couldn't go on, and if you look at the physical evidence, you'll see it does just the same. You all heard from Mr. Stockert, and he detailed his investigation for you all. And in his expert opinion, this was no accident. The first thing he noticed when he saw Mr. Robinson's plane was that that switch, that manual switch, was in the on position. You all learned what that means today. Flipping that switch at the wrong time is going to cause one thing, a crash. Right engine dead, left engine still running, plane flips over before hitting the ground. That's what happens when the manual switch is pulled, and that is exactly what happened to Mr. Robinson's plane. Right engine dead, left engine still running, flipped on its back before hitting the ground. Now, not only was the manual switch in the on position in Mr. Robinson's plane, but you learned from Mr. Pennington today that Mr. Robinson was asking about that switch prior to his crash. He knew the manual switch was in his plane. He knew what would happen if you deliberately pulled it, and that's exactly what he did. Now, you also got a chance to hear from plaintiff's witness, Rufus Pennington. And it's important to note that not only was Mr. Pennington close friends with Mr. Robinson, he got up on the stand today and told you all he's dating Mrs. Robinson. So of course he's going to conclude the automatic switch failed. These people are his friends. They're his close friends. What's most important here is the evidence he bases his conclusion on. And if you look closely, you'll see he has none. Mr. Pennington was not able to see the position of the automatic switch after the crash. So how can he reliably come to a conclusion that that's the part that failed? He can't. Now, there's no evidence to show that there was something wrong with the automatic switch. In fact, there's no evidence regarding the automatic switch at all after the crash. But what there is evidence to show is that the manual switch was in the on position. Mr. Stockard and Mr. Pennington saw that with their own eyes. Now, plaintiff wants you to believe that Flightworthy designed the defective piece, but they've given you no evidence to prove this. Their expert comes to conclusions that are driven by his own bias rather than the evidence. And Mrs. Robinson can't tell you whether or not that piece had a defect. And you can't blame her for that. It's not her job. It was plaintiff's job to prove this case to you today, and they have failed to do so. But I reiterate once again that it would not matter if they had, because Mr. Robinson took his life that day. He was an ambitious man. He cared about his position in the community. He couldn't handle it when that started to fall apart. Now, earlier today, my co-counsel asked you to pay close attention to all the evidence in this case and be wary of the questions that plaintiff will inevitably leave unanswered. Now, at the conclusion of trial, I'm asking you again to consider all of those things. The evidence in this case shows that Mr. Robinson took off that day knowing he wasn't going to land that plane, knowing he was going to flip the manual switch. Now, the events of today's case are a tragedy, and that is not to be ignored, but they are not Flightworthy's responsibility. Now, when you get your verdict sheet, there will only be 2 questions for you to respond to. Jury question number 1 will ask, was there a design, manufacturing, or marketing defect in Mr. Robinson's plane? The only answer that evidence supports is no. And then jury question number 4 will ask, did Gary Robinson commit suicide? Answer yes. And remember, this is a case about a failing bank, a forsaken affair, and a flipped switch. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor.
Yes.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Members of the jury, what defense counsel just told you is true. It's not the whole truth. This case did involve a failed bank. It did involve a forsaken affair, and it certainly involved a flipped switch. But there was more. They didn't tell you why the switch was flipped. It was flipped because Mr. Robinson knew that the engine of his plane had died. He was trying to bring it back to life. The switch was flipped because he knew that the switch was there for a reason. That's the switch that brings the engine back to life. So he flipped the switch, but on January 15th, the switch didn't work, and the engine stayed dead. And the reason it stayed dead is because that specific automatic switch was always defective. Mr. Stockard knew the switch was defective, and defense counsel didn't address any of the testing or lack of testing that he did. Because they can't. He should have done testing at every step of the way. He knew there were problems with the switch over a year before Mr. Robinson's death, but he ignored it. That's a defect right there. He reviewed a service bulletin draft within his own company about his switch, and then did nothing. That's a defect. He then knew people were criticizing the switch in his company and did nothing. He just wrote a service bulletin about it and called it a day. That's a defect. And because they can't excuse away Mr. Stockard's actions, they're telling you Mr. Robinson committed suicide. But the only evidence they had was that he had an affair and that his bank was in danger, that he was angry. They didn't show you anything else. So when you return to your jury room to deliberate, remember the actual evidence you heard. We showed you evidence that Mr. Stockard knew the switch was broken. and we show you evidence that he did nothing about it. Not only did the defense not stop that evidence and show you Mr. Stockard actually proved his switch couldn't fail, but instead they just abandoned arguing for their switch entirely. Hold flight-worthy liability. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Now what?
As always, the real power is there.
You all can take a minute to burn chambers, talk about crew line, and then we, that's good, keep that calm.
Okay. We'll be in recess briefly.
All rise.
Just got me.
All rise.
Here they come.
All right, please be seated. All right, well, they tell us we have two tasks. One is to determine the quote-unquote winning team. Select is it best oral or best advocate? This is the worst part of the night. I gotta say, first and foremost, just congratulations to all of you who participated here in the final, but also to all of those here who participated in the Carrigan Cup. This is a lot of work, and I didn't get to watch the other teams do it, but if these folks are any indication, one, I know that the competition made these people better, and they were amazing. So I know that those of you, even though you're not seated up here, that participated were also amazing. So just really want to acknowledge and thank all of you for your participation, and just a huge round of applause. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything else on that front, but in terms of having to select a team, I make a lot of decisions every day. This is not fun. And it's very difficult. You all were really incredible. But given that is our job and we will do our job, I will tell you it was very difficult and very close. And so I don't know that it was like all one way or the other way. But at the end of the day, we would select, not necessarily on substance, but on the advocacy, skills, and presentation, the plaintiffs team. So congratulations. Now, the continued challenge, and even more difficult, was to choose. This is like, how do you pick among your, I don't know, most precious items or your children or something like that. This was a very difficult choice. And I don't know, John or Sheila, do you want to?
It was really tough, both of you, and we have to pick from the plaintiff's side. And this doesn't detract from the two of you either, but it was very, very tough. And both of you performed very well, both from the podium and in front of the podium at times, which takes guts to get in front of the podium, I think. But am I announcing? You can. Which one? No, I didn't.
Suchinder.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I heard your name said, sorry, I murdered your name.
No worries, it's
Having
Carrigan.
a white bread name like Baker, it's, nobody messes up my name very much, at least. But I apologize, but we've selected you.
So just a couple, I guess we were asked to give some kind of comments and specifics, and we'll be around for a little bit. So if you have questions or anything in particular you want to follow up on, or just like, what were you thinking? That's all fine and good. After I assume there'll be wine, because I'm going to get a glass of wine, then you can ask me questions, okay? So I just got a couple of notes. I think that
First of all, if I could get you all to come and appear in my courtroom, it would make every day just a little bit brighter. You all really exceed the level of advocacy I see sometimes on a day, and from very experienced people. Now, I know that you put a lot of work into one problem, but the analytical skills that you applied were spectacular. And I only wish I could see that each and every day. I think that, Callian, the thing that kind of nudged you over the edge for me, in addition to just being brilliant and a great orator, was your command of the rules of evidence. And I thought that the way that you handled the argument with regard to the motion in limine and set forth 3 to 4 different bases on which a particular piece of evidence could come in. And though I reserved ruling until later to see what came in, you gave me several good options, so I was well primed once the evidence actually came in. And this is really a very useful technique when you're practicing for the judge. Because remember, I'm dealing with a lot. I have hundreds of cases, and they span the spectrum of topics. And I'm hearing about different pieces of evidence all day long. So to the extent that you can help get me ready, so I'm already thinking about it in advance and I'm not taken off guard, and I know what I'm listening for as the evidence comes in, that's just a really masterful move. The second thing that you did that I thought was very elegant, and I told my colleagues here, I like it because I used to do this as well when I did my cross-examination, so I thought it was really great. But rather than asking the witness, isn't it true? Or you did this correct. There was none of all those superfluous words. It was, this is what it was. This is what it was. This. So your narrative, your story is coming out, and all the witnesses are saying is, yes, that's correct. It just is so powerful and crisp that it helps things. So those are a couple of my comments. I will say that all of you did a really good job in direct examination, which everybody thinks that cross is the hardest. Direct examination, I think, is the hardest. And I see it messed up all the time. And you did a great job with that. So I'll turn it over to you, John, for your
As the NETA teacher, I was tempted. I came here with all understand. This chair, I switched chairs. I'm still not that short. I was looking for things like, non-leading questions on cross, leading questions on direct, no structure to a direct, having head notes and those types of things. And on opening and closing, I was looking at no theme, just blurring out words. All of you did those things, so I have very little to say about that. I have some nitpicky things that after we're all through, if you want to chat with me about eye contact sometimes during the middle of an examination or something like that, we can. I did take some notes. But the impressive thing to me, and NETA, we deal with practicing lawyers, the lawyers that appear in front of Judge Rodriguez. I was shocked at the structure that you put, the organized structure that you put in your arguments and opening statement. The head notes that you used on examination, now let's talk about this. It was really impressive, and I applaud all 4 of you, quite frankly, for having those things. So this law school, even though I went to the other law school, this law school must be teaching you something here. Congratulations.
I want to add
one, I agree with everything everyone else said. I thought you did a really great job. Also always enjoy the witnesses. You were great, you particularly. Yeah. And you were so shady. That's great. But, I've been doing that, I can't remember how many years this has been going on, and actually when Nita started at the law school, I was in college, and I was what we called the juror procurer for them. We would pay $5 a day in lunch, and there'd be an ad in the Daily Camera, and all these old people from the old age homes would call us jurors. But I got to watch trial work from, a very young age, and I just was commenting in there, the degree of sophistication, even compared, when I look back 10 years ago during this competition that you all had, is just magnificent. And I'm personally thrilled, as somebody who started out in the DA's office, that 3 of you want to go into criminal defense and public defenders. Your skills as an orator are going to be kind of wasted for 15 or 20 years in a big firm, so you might want to, I know it's good and it's intellectually challenging, but no, I'm just teasing. Anyway, thank you, and thank you all again. Mom, Dad would love this, right?
What?
Dad would love this.
Oh, yes. And Judge Rodriguez, every year, the judges say how astounded they are by the presenters, and they wish that they could come to their court. So they're
Never
living
heard
up to
that.
expectations. You're all great.
Yeah. Thank you.